Hi everyone. This video will teach you how to bring the Hyperloop from immense speeds to a standstill in a fast and safe way. The topics we will discuss are the most important factors that influence the design and the different ways of braking, including among others friction braking, magnetic braking, but also some more unconventional ones. So to start off, let's see what factors influence our design. If we look at the core function of the brakes, they need to slow our pod down to a standstill. Apart from this, we have quite some freedom in choosing a concept as long as it's both reliable and safe, of course. Our first constraint results from the fact that we're transporting people, which limits our braking force, expressed in g-force, which means the ratio between the force we experience and the force of gravity, which is always acting upon us. Generally, we can withstand forces of around 2 to 3 g without any trouble, but it would still be rather uncomfortable. Thus, we limit ourselves to a much smaller number, which should be based on other design factors, especially for the passenger experience and interior design. Our second consideration is the wear of the material, both for the track and the brakes themselves. If either material is too soft and in direct contact, it will wear out fast. Especially for the track, this is a concern, since you simply cannot change the track every year or few years even. The brakes also should not wear out as fast, as this imposes large cost on the operation of the vehicles. Lastly, we need to consider the general safety of the system. Since we will be traveling at speeds similar to those of aircraft, failing brakes would result in huge damage with fatal consequences. For this reason, a fail-safe and redundant mechanism is required for our brakes. This means that also our emergency braking has to be well thought out, as it has to occur instantaneously instead of slowly when we can nearing a station. Now we know what factors mainly influence our design, it's time to start looking at our options. Firstly, we can simply go for friction braking. This means we can brake pads around something to create a huge amount of friction, which dissipates our kinetic energy. We can do this either on the track or on a brake disc, which both have their own advantages. The big difference is the heat buildup. In a disc brake, you build up all of the heat in the disc, while you could also distribute this over the entire brake distance of our track. This means that we can apply a larger friction force to the track before we overheat an element. On the other hand, it's easier to replace a brake disc than a track segment. The second method is passive magnetic braking. Here we also use the same principle as electrodynamic suspension, namely using eddy currents to generate a force from the magnetic field. By moving the magnets along the track, our current starts moving and this generates a force. However, instead of the normal force we use for levitation, we now use the drag that these magnets impose, so the force opposite to our velocity vector. By bringing our magnets closer to the track, the drag will increase. The big difference here is that we do not directly touch the track, and thus we will not wear it out. The disadvantage is that we will have a decreased brake performance and that the system is more expensive as we require some very strong magnets. Another magnetic braking option could be to use a linear induction motor, the same that we used for our acceleration. But this time we set it to reverse and use it to slow down the pod whilst also regenerating part of our kinetic energy. Due to the placement of the limbs, it's impossible to do an emergency stop in between limbs, and therefore this concept is deemed less safe. Now into some more exotic methods. We can look at parachutes. These have proven to work for very high speeds as rocket and spacecraft use them at supersonic speeds already. The big problem we would have, though, is that this principle entirely based on air friction, which will be greatly reduced in the vacuum tube, and needs to have big enough space for deployment, both of which are very limited in our tube. Staying inside the space vector, other options is to use retro rockets to slow us down. The disadvantage here is this requires a lot of harmful propellant and it produces a lot of heat and loading onto our structure. making it very unsafe for passenger transport, especially in the confined tube we're in. Alternatively, we can use cold gas thrusters. These are less harmful and do not heat up our system. However, it only allows for relatively small forces, meaning that we require a lot of time to brake and that we need to refuel after every brake, even if we're emergency braking. So to summarize, we've looked at the most important factors on our design and the different concepts we have for braking. Looking at how these concepts perform with respect to our design objectives allows us to make a good choice for our final selection, but we will leave this reasoning up to you. Will magnets work? And how are you going with simple friction brakes? Or are you even looking into parachutes, rockets, or other ways of braking?